About 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago, Nirmal and I came back from India and we're at Ananda village. That's where we landed and had housing and began doing jobs there. There was a period where we moved into a beautiful home and that was heated by firewood, or at least had the option to be heated by firewood, which was much more common in the 80s and 90s and it's kind of gradually lost favor among many people. But I had always been a great fan of heating with firewood. This is a little bit of a strange subject, but trust me, it ties into some interesting spiritual themes. So, being that we got back in May, I realized and moved into our place in late May or early June, I think. We spent the first few weeks kind of getting furniture together, making the house feel more like a home. And then I did the math and figured that we needed a whole lot of firewood and we didn't have a lot of time to get it because typically in my days of heating with firewood, which over the years I've done it for many years, in fairly cold climates, not like tundra, Arctic kind of climate, but winters used to be pretty cold at Ananda Village. And I like to have 1 year to 2 years for the wood to season, to be stacked up and seasoned to get nice and dry. And we didn't have that because winter comes in October or November, or at least by December, certainly by sometime in December, fires are commonly needed. So to get the wood to be dry was going to take the whole summer. So I wanted to jump right on it. And it was interesting to watch how when I really turned my focus on this, I found that there was all sorts of blessing and benefit and lots of lessons involved in it. Because cutting firewood can be a very annoying process, and it's quite understandable why people would gravitate away from it. It's heavy, there's bugs, there's dirt, there's lots of mass to deal with. It takes, to do it efficiently and in a time-effective way, takes a certain investment of tools that often make a lot of noise or are somewhat dangerous. It's easy to get injured. We hear horror stories. I remember back to my first experiences with firewood, trying to cut with a bow saw or a hand saw, which was just absolutely miserable. I mean, you just cut, back and forth and trying to split the wood with an axe that wasn't, maybe wasn't sharp or wasn't quite the right thing, or, going at pieces of wood that were going to be inherently very difficult to split and having the thing just bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce. And, finally I'd get one piece split and the next piece split and, but the wood would be wet on the inside, and so it wouldn't burn very well. etc. The horror stories just went on and on. But once I kind of learned and I asked questions and I observed, because there were many people, I remember Jaya and others who used firewood and had for decades, and questioning them about what did they do, when did they do it, how did they do it. And I discovered that there's a very nice rhythm to it. It can be done in a very nice way. It got to the point where Nirmala and I would work on the splitting together with this big heavy-duty machine that would slowly push, split the wood apart with this wedge that would come very slowly, and it would just kind of, with pressure, it would just pry the wood apart. And, it was fairly noisy. We would be wearing headphones and gloves and, get ourselves girded up for a few hours of work like this. over the span of several days. We would often put in a day or two of work splitting the wood, but it was very meditative. And stacking the wood, again, was a very meditative thing for me. And hauling the wood and burning the wood and, getting the kindling together, getting the fire starting stuff together. Somehow I just really enjoyed the process. And that's one of the points of me talking about firewood at all, is in our spiritual life and in life in general, we are often busy focused on the result out there. So it's like we're here, the result is over there, and we're not interested in the process. We're interested in the result. We're interested in the goal. We're interested in that thing over there. When in fact, it helps to be interested in the moment, interested in today. And so in the firewood cutting process, one of the first steps is to figure out what you're going to cut and why you're going to cut it. And at Ananda Village, we would cut trees that were dead, often trees that were down and dead, that had fallen over, but preferably only fallen over recently, because if they had been laying over for a long time, then they would get wet and moldy and start to decompose, and you don't want to be using that for firewood. So identifying the right stuff to burn. Obviously, we would leave certain trees standing dead so that birds and animals would have places to nest, and there's a whole ecosystem that develops around that. But forests are productive places as well, and they actually thrive with a certain amount of pruning and thinning. And so it's helpful to clean out some of the dead stuff so that disease doesn't begin to spread, etc. The health of the forest itself becomes better with a keen eye towards assisting that process, not dominating it, but just a little nudge here, a little nudge there helps the forest, taking away branches that are blocking little trees growing, etc., that kind of thing. So identifying it as a kind of with an eye towards both the firewood that we wanted to harvest, but also the forestry aspect, looking as a husbandman, the steward of the land. How can we assist the health of this whole ecosystem? Then comes the day of the cutting, or the days of the cutting and the schlepping. And what I realized is that every part of that process was good exercise, was fresh air, was a chance to be out in nature, was a chance to do something that you could see the results. You would begin cutting and you'd load up the trailer or load up the truck, whatever it might be, haul it home, unload it, and you'd have a little pile of wood. And then you'd go and do it again, and it would be bigger. And by the time a day or two had gone by, you'd have a heck of a nice pile of wood. Now, of course, it all needed to be processed and then stacked and then carried. I mean, all of this, gets spread out over a period of weeks. The beautiful thing is that when you start, I like to do my work in the wintertime when it was cool. I would pick nice, crisp fall and winter days, but I would be cutting a year ahead so that I could have lots of time to do that work. And then basically an entire calendar year would go by before I would need to burn that wood. That's how it's helpful to look at certain aspects of our lives. Certain things we don't grow into them in a jump, in a leap. We grow into them in a very natural, organic, gradual way. It's the same thing with gardening or farming. You can't cram at the last minute. You can't, if you're going to have a garden, you can't wait until mid-October and then plant what you want to harvest at the end of October. You have to start in March or April or June or July, whatever rhythm those crops have. It takes that time. And so it's just helpful to look to the longer rhythms of our lives and realize that we can stay centered in today. We can stay centered in the part of the process that is now, that's very grounding, that's very healing, that's very nurturing on a certain level, and yet keep in mind the longer rhythm process. And that natural evolution of life brings about prosperity, and it brings about a natural grace. There's a natural, it reminds me of the expression of Sri Yukteswar's, the active expression of virtue gives rise to the keenest intelligence. When we actively try to help, we actively try to nurture, we actively try to, in a grounded way, create and organize and take a dynamic role in the making of our lives. We don't just hire it out to everyone, to someone else to do. Every time something breaks, someone else has to fix it. Every time we need something, we need this kind of vegetable or that kind of produce or whatever. Oh, okay, I have to go to the store. I have to order it from online or something. Try to find the things that we can do ourselves. Grow the flowers, have a little garden, grow sprouts if nothing else. Even in your kitchen, you can grow sprouts in a jar with a piece of screen on the top of it. It's little things like that help us to feel connected to the process of our lives. And in so doing, we find divine grace and we find bliss. Bliss in the moment, not bliss in the goal. Bliss in the goal is fine too, as long as it engaged in the process today, not waiting and waiting for joy that's out there somewhere, but finding the joy in the moment today. There is God's grace, and it's waiting, that grace is waiting for all of us. I thought it would be fun for you to see some photos of the actual firewood that I was speaking about. So the first two photos are from the pile far away from the house, and the second two are the one on the porch. Namaste.